I'd like to say something about Jim Enstrom. It's really been an honor to stand in his corner now and then. Jim was mistreated at UCLA. They lied about whether or not he had funds to pay himself. They ejected him from his department, although he was definitely the best scientist in that department. And he fought, and he won. He didn't win everything, but he won. He still can claim his association with the UCLA. And that was a great triumph, and it was a pleasure to be a little part of that. Jim was receiving an award about a year or so ago, and he and his wife were there, Marta. She's probably 5 feet tall if she stands on her tiptoes, and Jim's over 6 feet. And I was at the table with Jim and Marta and other dignitaries, although I wasn't a dignitary, and made a comment about Jim. I wanted the other dignitaries there to know who he was. I said he's a rigorous scientist, and he is, in my opinion, the very best epidemiologist California has, and probably in the United States. Marta, who was a judge, and now she may be a retired judge, and Jim's wife, said, "You're wrong. He's the best in the world." Now, I'm not going to argue with a wife and a judge at the same time. So I'll admit Jim is maybe the best epidemiologist in the world. I know he's the most honest and the most courageous of all the epidemiologists I've met. My background was at San Diego State in physics. I emphasized nuclear physics there. I completed that degree. For my senior project, I did signal and noise separation, which is what epidemiologists are doing. So you can detect little tiny signals in a lot of noise. I did my master's thesis on inhaled radionuclides, as would occur from an accident of a reactor. I also probably took as a minor, although I was a physicist, I took as a minor radiation biology. So I took the advanced physiology and 2 courses in advanced radiation biology. I noticed that the papers and publications from the University of Rochester were the best that I'd seen in this area of inhaled radionuclides. And so I applied for a PhD there and was accepted. After I got there, I found that that was a residual from the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project involved a lot of work with radioactive materials, and they had a secret project, the Rochester Project, that looked at workers basically inhaling radionuclides. They had assembled scientists the same quality as those that developed the nuclear weapons, except these were physicians, physiologists, chemists, and so on. And they established the program in Rochester in radiation biology and biophysics, and I stumbled into that. I talked with the Newell Stannard, who had helped run the Manhattan radiobiology project, and when he asked to become a part of the University of Rochester Medical School, they made him the dean. So he was a pretty influential guy. I asked, why did you accept me? Why would this program in radiation biology and biophysics accept a physicist? And he said, we can teach a physicist biology, but we can't teach a biologist physics. So I did an inhalation study, and it related to the only fatal nuclear accident that the U.S. has ever had. How many people have heard of this SL1 reactor accident? Yeah, there were 3 people died. And that was probably, according to my advisor who was on sabbatical there, a murder-suicide, a love triangle and difficulties as an employee. The person actually climbed on the reactor, took away the safety devices, and pulled the rods up and killed himself and the 2 other people there. Some people are nodding. I'm happy to see that. I could talk a lot like anyone, but I think to help Jim Enstrom's talk on particulate matter, I'd like to review my experiences with PM. I came to University of California, Irvine from a postdoc at the Inhalation Toxicology Research Institute, or Lovelace, in Albuquerque. And it was because of the the oil embargo in the 70s. And California was looking at London and saying, what happens if we have a London? Do we have inversions? 340 a year in Los Angeles. Do we have damp air? Yeah, blows in off the ocean. Plus, we have ozone, and they were panicked. And so I was contacted by the Society of Toxicologist's first president, Harold Hodge, who was my advisor's advisor. Just think of him as Yoda. And he said, California needs you, because I had the training in the physics of aerosols and so on. At Rochester, I took half of the medical school courses, and so I could understand medical events, and I could understand the air chemistry, and I certainly could understand inhalation. I'd done that at San Diego State, at Rochester, and at Lovelace. So I was asked to start the Air Pollution Health Effects Lab, and it's still functioning since 1972. And we've studied probably 500, 400 atmospheric combinations there. And I was asked once, what's my conclusion? What's the most, and also I've been asked what's the most controversial thing I've said. I was asked this by an EPA person. And the answer to both questions is the same, and that is, I think the air is already a little too clean. Microbiologists will tell you that our hands are too clean, our food is too clean, and so on. And I think there's similar things going on in air pollution. So I'm studying air pollution combinations, and I decided to focus on lung defenses. If you see pathology, it's a little too late. John might tell you, it's not always too late, but it's getting late. But if you can study lung defenses, as long as the lung defends itself, you can be a heavy smoker and have a healthy lung. So I decided to study lung defenses and developed half a dozen endpoints, particle clearance and things like that. I got a call in the early 90s from Arden Pope. I didn't know who he was. He was in Utah. And he said he wanted to set up a little private meeting of some scientists to discuss a finding. And so I said, sure. And he wanted a toxicologist. So I went to meet Arden, and Doug Dockery was there. I think Joel Schwartz might have been there. And they presented their time series data showing increased deaths at very tiny quantities of particulate material. We're talking micrograms per cubic meter. Now, a cubic meter of air itself weighs about 2 kilograms. So if you take a few micrograms, how many zeros are you going to put out there? And they presented this data, and they had lags, and they had averaging, and so on. And that made sense to me, actually. They were averaging maybe 4 or 5 days, and then looking at how today differed from that average. And that was what they call their level. It isn't really a level, it's an increment. And then they were doing lags, and it does take a while for inflammation, maybe a day or two, to maximize. But then they said, as a toxicologist, having studied hundreds of combinations, what's causing this? And my answer was, nothing could cause that at those doses. If you take the most toxic thing I know other than microbial pollutants, if you take anthrax spores, they are deadly, in maybe a dozen or so. But if you take the most toxic chemical I know, botulism toxin, at the level that we've set PM 2.5, I don't think that would harm you. We're talking about 10 micrograms per cubic meter, and that means to get 10 grams, you'd have to breathe 1 million cubic meters, right? Calculate how long it takes you to breathe a million cubic meters. It's at least 30 years. And then the deposition of particles is probably 20% is a good number. You exhale probably 80% of this material. So you have to say, well, it would take maybe 120 years to get your 10 grams. And then you ask how much of the time, now that's assuming you were breathing it 24 hours a day. How much of the time are we breathing outdoor air? Probably an hour or two. So you'd have to, divide by 20. So the idea is, no matter how toxic a substance is, a chemical substance, I, as a toxicologist, cannot find anything that would harm you at the levels that we set PM 2.5. After that meeting, and I indicated to Arden and Doug that I didn't think there was anything that could do that. Press releases happened, and all over in the news. 64,000 people die from the pollutant that's the least regulated. That was in New York Times, LA Times, Science, almost any publication that had Time or Science in it, there was this panicky headline. I got a call from someone in the California Air Resources Board, and this was before it really was run by politicians. You had people like Hagensmith in charge and so on, real scientists. And this person said, we are worried because all of these headlines, all these press releases are probably going to force us to come up with regulations that are going to damage California. We depend on agriculture, we depend on transportation, and that produces particulate material. So he asked, what should we do? And I said, well, we should have a conference. So we held the first conference international conference on particulate air pollution and health, probably around 1994, something like that, 93. And the first speakers were Arden Pope, Joel Schwartz, and Doug Dockery. They were followed by Mugovkar, Lyon, and other people who set the record straight. They said that the epidemiology isn't high quality, it isn't sound. Then the conference, I directed the conference and figured out the program. Then we went, and I didn't try to find people that were contrary. I just wanted to know what the real science was. So I had the experts there. And the conference proceeded, and it was pretty clear to those who attended the conference that there probably wasn't a problem with particulate material. Then comes EPA, and under Carol Browner and Bill Clinton, a person that I know, and I like her, Mary Nichols, I like her as a person, came in and gave us the PM 2.5 standard. It's draconian. And Mary said that what she did was when she was appointed to be in charge of air and radiation, she knew what she wanted to accomplish. She wanted a tough PM standard. What's her background? Is it science? No. Try an environmental lawyer. And so Mary said that was what she wanted to accomplish. And you have hundreds of scientists contributing to the literature that's reviewed every 4 or 5 years. And Mary said, I could point to that and say, this is why I want this regulation on PM 2.5. And I think she felt good about that because she felt she was serving some higher purpose, and that was probably to rein in industry. Then, after that, I was appalled, and I wrote the book, The Particulate Air Pollution Controversy, and it solidified, it brought together all of these ideas that I'd heard at the conference. I had 3 more international conferences on human health effects of particles. And that book basically summarized what the problems were, why particles were not toxic, why the EPI had to be challenged, and several other things. And I'll mention a couple of them when I wrap up. Since then, I've had 3 more conferences, international conferences. We've published proceedings and so on. And I felt that also my son, who's an associate professor at University of Houston at Clear Lake, right there near NASA, we worked for several years and did an air pollution textbook. It's not a very good textbook, really. You can find flaws with it. But in order to get it published, you couldn't really be a Willie Soon Are they going to publish Willie Soon's air pollution textbook for use in colleges? I don't think so. So there's some compromises in there. But we've got it published. Back to PM 2.5, I've told you a little bit about how I got dragged into that. And I think the conclusions from that experience, I have several. And some of them are scientific and some are just observations. I think the first thing that comes to mind from all of these experiences is that no regulation should ever be issued where the damage exceeds the benefit. Right? I mention this to politicians. I mention this to government agencies, and they're shocked at something like that. And I ask, why doesn't your agency do this? And the answer I get is, well, it's not policy. The next thing that I see that I think needs to be changed is that risk assessments should not be on something like CO2 or ozone or particulate material. They should be on the decisions that you're going to make about that material. Are you going to close down all of the coal-fired power plants because of your risk assessment on particulate material with no lower thresholds for effects? That's not wise. A risk assessment should be on the decisions about a specific material and how it affects the overall public health or the public good, or even the environmental health and the environmental good. So that's a conclusion I see, is by looking at agents one at a time, we're driving the theoretical, hypothetical risks of each one down, and up goes other risks. And that's just stupid, to use a word that I think everyone understands. The other conclusions that I have is PM, or particulate material, it's not a good indicator of anything. It's a mass. It's no chemical specification. And let's say we judged medications that way, right? Only by mass we determined which medications were safe and which were not. Or let's say we judged food additives that way. Why in heck should we judge an air pollutant that way? It varies tremendously. And PM 2.5 is determined by weighing a filter after it has passed a cutoff that collects a cutoff entry, something like an impactor, or there are other devices can do it, that has a 50% cutoff at 2.5 micrometers aerodynamic diameter. So those are small particles. They don't carry much mass, in fact. The problem that you have with that cutoff, and I've argued against it, along with at least one person from EPA who was on my side and we lost, I've argued that it's too high. In other words, PM 2.5, that aerodynamic cutoff, allows dust to come in. And you'd mentioned visibility. And there's a lot of fine dust in the air, especially in the southwest, where you see not only no deaths from particulate air pollution, but some of the risks are actually negative with particulate air pollution, fine particulate air pollution. If the cutoff were 1 microgram per cubic meter, then there would be a better division between ordinary soil blowing around and what we produce in manufacturing and with our automobiles and so on. And then the epidemiology would be cleaner. I think they would not see effects that were as strong as they do. And their effects are so weak, I won't say as to be laughable, but they're so weak as a tentative conclusion, you have to say that the thing that they're measuring, particle mass, is a surrogate for other factors. So I think the cutoff is bad. The other thing that I conclude from my experiences is that particulate material, and in fact the pollutant mix in general, varies a great deal with location. And I think even the EPA divides the country into something like 4 or 5 segments, south, southwest, northwest, and so on. But they have standards, and it's not their fault, it's Congress's fault. They have standards that are national standards. And so in California, when the dust blows, we're out of compliance for PM 2.5, and we're forced to do something about it. And what can we do about it? Climb on diesels, which are contributing maybe 1% of the problem. So having a national standard for air contaminants is something that I think needs to be looked at. And it's not being looked at very, very seriously. And when John mentioned visibility, I was on CASAC's PM committee. Now, when the person called me from CASAC, I was nominated by, I think, 40 different groups, commercial groups and so on. And when the committee accepted me, I called the person who had organized the committee, and I said, "Do you know what you're doing?" Asking me to be on an EPA Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee for particulate material. He said, "We don't want no shrinking violets. They should get Willie." But he then resigned. He retired. And so they were stuck with me. So I think he was getting even, but I'm not sure. It was an interesting experience on that committee, and I know Willie's concept of 100%, and I was on the National Academy of Sciences committee on the ethics of EPA's human experiments. And I agree with Willie that these are corrupt, but I think that if we have an opportunity to participate in those committees, we should do it. For the first time, a government report cited Instrum's paper and other papers and acknowledged that John Dunn had come to a teleconference and testified for the committee. To me, that is a huge triumph. It's like a crack in the dam, so to speak. And so I try, when I'm nominated for these committees, I say yes. I've been nominated for 2 committees that are more influential, the Scientific Advisory Board for EPA, SAB. That's right there with the administrator. And so the kind of points that I'm making with you, I think the administrator would like to hear too, because their agency's future depends on it. I mean, the truth wins out eventually. I was nominated by the Commerce Department. I have no idea who in the Commerce Department did that, but they nominated me for SAB and also for CASAC, the committee that looks over air and water and all of that. Again, I would question EPA's sanity if they accept me on these committees, because I think they know what they're getting into. And someone once said when I was on a committee, we invited Phalen here to cause trouble. And I consider that a noble duty. The other thing that I think the last thing I'd like to mention is that our regulations are on a 4 to 5 year cycle. So now you come up with some draconian thing like diesel engines have to cut their emissions by a certain amount. How long does it take to redesign a reliable diesel engine that can actually transport goods and plow fields and so on? Maybe 15, 20 years. But then 4 or 5 years later, there's new rules. So that cycle is very poor. It doesn't allow time to adapt. And again, I don't blame EPA for that. Congress says that's what you have to do. I'd like to just make a couple comments. As I look around the room, I see some of the very best and brightest people in the United States with average age of about 70, which is, I'm past that. And I think to reach the people that need to be reached, I recommend books and I recommend books that are geared toward high school and college students. Like I said, when you've got a book in 600 libraries, people are reading those books. And it doesn't take too many people to make a big difference in the world. And I use Jim and I use Willie and John as examples. And they have a great impact. So I'd like to see more books coming from this group. And I don't think they have to be as technical as our papers, but they have to teach the importance of honesty and virtue and what science really is and what it should be. And it will inspire young people. When I write a book, I've got one coming out, in fact it's being printed now on core ethics. I write it for myself when I'm 19 years old, when I was 19 years old. So I think we need impact beyond this room, really. I think the final comment is I've studied aging a bit, and one of the biggest factors in successful aging is having a purpose. And I think with our speakers we just heard, they have a purpose. The tragedy is people like Willie, where is he going to get his support? Is he going to be a taxi driver next year? So I think we should all be thinking about how we support people like that, because they are rejected by their institutions. Okay, that's what I have to say. And you said there was time for Q&A. Yeah. Oh, thanks.
Now you know why I really like this guy. I mean, Ed, he's a guy who was in the belly of the beast. I mean, good grief. California, the whole thing. And he's willing to tell the truth even if he knows that there's going to be somebody out there that will tell all of his friends in California that he's a troublemaker. Anyway, go ahead, questions. If you.
By the way, thank you whoever put the flag up. It was almost too much to bear emotionally seeing Willie give his emotional speech standing in front of that flag.
You talked about, when you talk about particulate matter, okay, I'm a mechanic, primarily a diesel mechanic. I've worked on a lot of diesels. I'm working on them now. And I will make this observation in practical terms. I've worked on diesels that were built in the 40s and 50s. I've worked on diesels I'm working on running right now that's 3 years old and supposed to meet Tier 4 final regulations and all this nonsense. And I can tell you that we've got 25 and 30-year-old equipment out there running that is cleaner burning, gets better fuel economy, makes better power than a Tier 4 final engine does, and the cost per hour for maintenance and repair is at least triple. I'm not against, it's like I told somebody, I'm not against clean air. I'm not against different things, but you talk about particulate matter. And I'm also got one torn apart right now, an engine torn apart right now, that the problem with it is they are using information to build these engines, to manufacture these engines that is flawed. It's a lie.
Yeah, well.
And it destroys the practicality of having something that you can use.
It makes you think that that's the purpose.
I'm certain
and I've had
it is.
one diesel person, a mechanic, say that he thought that the large engine manufacturers were behind a lot of these regulations because it would drive the small guys out of work.
Well, that's part of it. But
And
here's
also that 4-year thing, and I'm sorry, sorry to interrupt you.
No problem.
That 4-year, 5-year cycle, they wanted the diesel soot mass cut. So people made diesel engines that would have a lot less mass, but 10 to 20 times the number of fine particles. So now all of a sudden, 4 or 5 years later, it's the fine particles that are killing us. That'll be the future. And it'll also be the visibility that'll be killing us. In KSAC PM, they had something like 3 or 4 visibility people on that committee, and one of them said, can you imagine the horror of going to a national park that's supposed to be beautiful, and you look out and you can't see the peaks and so on. And so they want particle standards to protect visibility, and they want to call it a health standard.
Right. Well, one final observation is,
Yes, sir.
I mean, and you work on these, And then the other thing that happened, and this happened primarily from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s, the EPA and others came out with regulations that said, okay, you've got to reduce particulate matter, you've got to reduce emissions, broad term. And so they did. Electronics came in, they became more sophisticated, and we had engines that, yes, they did reduce emissions of all kinds. But then they did something else that was very interesting. They increased power and torque, usable power and torque output skyrocketed. 1,000 cubic inch engine, for instance, went from 1,000 pound-feet of torque to now almost 2,000 pound-feet of torque. In other words, torque is what moves the load. That's what does the work. And so we've doubled almost the power output per cubic inch.
Right.
But so the EPA and them comes back and says, oh, you've committed a crime because you have defeated our regulations. We're going to fine you for doing what we told you to do to begin with. You've defeated our regulations.
They don't like you.
And then they come back and the aggregate fines are up into the trillions of dollars now in all those years. And we are all sitting in this room paying that cost because it drives the cost of everything else up.
There's another economics factor that I think is more important, and we dealt with it in California, and that's how I originally met Robert. The big trucking companies want the EPA to eliminate the little companies. They want to take advantage of their inventory changeover that allows them to do things that the mom and pop trucking company can't do. So when you ask them for help, when you're trying to fight the EPA on a small particle regulation that affects diesel engines, they aren't there.
Well, and I found that to be the case. That's like John Deere. We have a lot of John Deere equipment. We have some Cat and Komatsu, but we have John Deere primarily. You go and try to get help from somebody at John Deere, you might as well go talk to a chair.
If you want to get help on fighting the climate thing, do you go to Exxon and Rex Tillerson?
No.
No, that's the point.
By the way, thank you very much for that comment. I'm going to give you a hand. Thank you.
Living in western North Carolina mountains, we use Duke Power for our electricity, and the last 10 years they've been pretty much, responding to the EPA, et cetera. They've reduced, they have reduced their coal-burning power plants in quantity, and they did put precipitator stacks on all of them, and they're all nice and clean. What's still left, all you see is steam coming out of these stacks. Now, the eco crazies in my region, and there are many, because my hometown, Asheville, is the home of all the Weather Bureau, NOAA, all the federal, for the entire United States is located in Asheville. So this draws a lot of people in that are kind of, for lack of a better term, greenies. And so now they're converting to natural gas, and they're against that too, because that's still a fossil fuel, of course. My question, though, is we have these same people that are even opposing the use of methane, so to speak. They're against using any fossil fuel because they claim it pollutes the air to the extent that people are having asthma reactions. Are there any documented studies that would show that any kind of fossil fuel burning is really causing asthma, or are there other factors involved?
Yeah, we can both do this one.
Thank you.
This is like a tag team match. Where's Malloy? Okay, Malloy is going to talk later. He did an ozone study on Sacramento using the records from UC Davis and found no relationship between ozone and disease or asthma admissions to the hospital.
And with particles, as particulate matter has declined, asthma rates have gone up. The place that you see no asthma essentially is in some of the villages in China where they burn dirty fuels all the time. They don't even know what the disease is in some of those.
Well, you have to remember that allergies are what causes asthma. Okay? Now, in the small particle load, you may have allergens, pollens, various things that could be a factor in terms of producing asthma. But asthma is not produced by ozone. Ozone is not an allergen. What ozone is it's a heavy molecule in the air, and when you breathe it, you can tell the difference. It's a mechanical difference, has nothing to do with asthma. Now, if you have asthma or reactive airway disease, and somebody puts you in an environment where the ozone is elevated, you will notice a difference. But that's something that you study all the time. Is there anything I missed on that one?
No, I don't think so. I think one of the points that has been sort of subtly made is that we notice changes in things. We adapt to whatever the pollution level is. And I was on one study section where someone was showing that these little increments beyond, say, a 5-day average in pollution could actually have some apparent effect. Now, I think it could be spurious. But a pulmonary physician said, well, of course, it was the 5 clean days that killed them. They were losing their ability to handle the material. But also, you know, kids raised on farms tend to have less asthma and so on. And that's why I made early on this comment that the air seems to be too clean already.
You know, one of the things that reminded how much I like Robert Phalen is
Bob is good enough.
the American Association for the Advancement of Science has a newsletter. And they went out and interviewed the prominent doctor who knows all about air pollution, and the headline statement of the article, with a nice picture of him sitting in his chair, was, "The air is too clean." And the reason is, and even though Malloy will object to my saying this because he says he's not so sure about it, the reason is the theory goes like this: the hygiene that we have now reduces the amount of what I would call desensitization that normally occurred in childhood. And so, in fact, you've heard now recently of pediatricians saying, give your kids some peanuts when they're really young. We all know how you take care of allergies. You do desensitization when there's so much of a problem that you need to get it. Well, patients who have asthma have an allergic disease. So you have to deal with it that way.
Right.
Can I say anything more would
No,
you say anything more?
I think you hit it pretty well, but
There we go.
biology is a use it or lose it proposition. And if I wanted to harm everyone's health here, I could set up a clean room with HEPA filters and keep you in it for about a week, and your defenses would decline. So I think one of the problems with having air that's too clean is there are episodes that you cannot control. There will be the food that burns, you know, the popcorn in the microwave for me last week. There will be the Santa Ana wind. There will be the grass fire. You know, there will be the accidental emission. There will be the pollen season. And we de-adapt when the air is too clean. I gave a talk once at one of the petroleum companies downtown Los Angeles, and they took me out to lunch, and they said, something has gone wrong with the air out here, because we used to be able to walk around and have lunch, and now we're having respiratory problems. What has been added to the air? And I said, what did you do to the indoor air? And they said, that's not it. We've got filtered indoor air now, and it's totally clean. I said, well, that's your problem. You know, you lose it, you use it or you lose it. And that's why I think if I were to develop something for indoor air pollution, it would be a pollution generator that you would have.
When it comes down to it, one of the reasons I was so happy that Robert had decided to come to this meeting is I wanted a person who was a toxicologist who really had an understanding of what's going on in the EPA, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Thanks.